The Quiet Panic. You guys have been asking me for weeks to cover more paranormal encounters, and honestly, I've been putting this one off because it still gives me chills just thinking about it. But I finally found a story that's so disturbing, so absolutely terrifying, that I knew I had to share it with you. Picture this. You're home alone on a quiet suburban street minding your own business when suddenly you notice something moving outside your window. But here's the thing that makes this story different from every other creepy encounter you've heard before. What this person saw wasn't just someone lurking around their property or trying to break in. What they witnessed was something so bizarre, so physically impossible, that it defied all logic. I'm talking about heads. Just heads. No bodies, no shoulders, nothing else. Just human heads floating at window level, staring directly inside. And before you start thinking this is some kind of joke or urban legend, let me tell you something. I've spent hours researching this case, verifying details and cross-referencing witness accounts. This actually happened, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand why this encounter has haunted me for months. But first, let me give you some context about what makes this so terrifying. Most home invasion stories follow a predictable pattern. Someone tries to break in. There's a confrontation. Maybe some property gets stolen. But this case breaks every rule in the book. The witnesses never felt like they were in immediate physical danger from an intruder. Instead, they experienced something far worse. The slow creeping realization that what they were seeing couldn't possibly be real. Yet it was happening right in front of their eyes. And here's what really gets me about this whole thing. I've covered hundreds of paranormal stories over the years, and I can usually find some logical explanation or at least a theory that makes sense. But this one has me completely stumped. The physics alone should make this impossible, yet multiple witnesses saw the exact same thing on different nights. Now I know what you're thinking. You're probably wondering how I even found out about this story in the first place. Well, it started when I received a message from someone I'll call Sarah. Sarah had been watching my channel for months, and she finally worked up the courage to reach out because she needed to tell someone what happened to her family. But she made me promise that I wouldn't reveal their real names or exact location, and honestly, after hearing what they went through, I completely understand why. Sarah lives in what most people would consider the perfect neighborhood. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained houses, the kind of place where everyone knows their neighbors and kids ride their bikes until the streetlights come on. It's the last place you'd expect something genuinely terrifying to happen. But that's exactly what makes this story so unsettling. Evil doesn't always announce itself with creaking floorboards and flickering lights. Sometimes it shows up in the most ordinary places when you least expect it. The first incident happened on a Tuesday night in late October. Sarah was in her living room watching television when she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. At first, she thought it might be a neighbor's cat or maybe a raccoon getting into the garbage. But when she looked toward the window, what she saw made her blood run cold. There, perfectly framed in her living room window, was a human head. Not a person standing outside looking in, but literally just a head floating at eye level with the glass. No neck, no body, nothing below the chin line. Just a pale, expressionless face staring directly at her with unblinking eyes. Sarah told me that her first instinct was to rationalize what she was seeing. Maybe it was a reflection from the television, or perhaps someone was playing an elaborate prank with mirrors or some kind of projection. But as she sat there frozen on her couch, the head began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it turned from side to side as if scanning the interior of her home. That's when the real terror set in. Sarah realized that whatever this thing was, it was aware of her presence. It wasn't just some random apparition or trick of the light. This thing was actively observing her, studying her, and she had no idea what it wanted or what it was capable of doing. She managed to grab her phone and call her husband, who was working late at the office. But by the time she looked back at the window, the head was gone. When her husband arrived home 20 minutes later, he found Sarah sitting in the kitchen with all the lights on, clutching a baseball bat and refusing to go anywhere near the living room windows. Now, her husband Mark was naturally skeptical. He's a practical guy, works in accounting, not the type to believe in ghost stories or supernatural encounters. He spent the next hour checking every inch of their property, looking for evidence that someone had been there. No footprints in the flower beds, no disturbed mulch, no signs that anyone had been standing outside their window. The ground beneath the living room window was completely undisturbed, but here's where things get really interesting. Mark noticed something that Sarah hadn't mentioned in her initial panic. The living room window where she saw the head is about 4.5 feet off the ground from the outside. For someone to look through that window while standing on the ground, they'd have to be at least 6.5 feet tall. And even then you'd see their shoulders, their chest, some part of their body below the neckline. Mark measured everything twice to make sure he wasn't missing something obvious. The windowsill, the height from the ground, the angles from different positions in the yard. No matter how he calculated it, there was no way for just a head to appear at window level unless someone was somehow floating in midair. That night, they installed motion sensor lights around the entire perimeter of their house and made sure all the curtains were drawn tight before going to bed. Mark was convinced that whatever Sarah had seen was just a case of mistaken identity combined with the stress of being alone in the dark. He figured the new lights would either scare off any potential prowlers or prove that there was nothing there to begin with. But 3 nights later, the motion sensors went off. Mark jumped out of bed and rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The backyard was flooded with bright white light from the sensors, and there, illuminated like actors on a stage, were 3 heads floating at different heights near their back fence. Not 3 people. 3 heads, suspended in the air at impossible angles, all turning in unison to look directly at the house the moment the lights came on. Mark told me later that what disturbed him most wasn't just seeing the heads themselves, but the way they moved with perfect coordination, as if they were all controlled by the same consciousness. He grabbed his phone to record what he was seeing, but the moment he lifted the device, all 3 heads simply vanished. Not like they ducked down or moved away, but like they had never been there at all. The motion sensor stayed active for another few minutes, indicating that something was still moving around out there, but Mark couldn't see anything else. The next morning, they called the police and filed a report, though they were careful about how they described what they'd witnessed. The responding officer was professional and thorough, taking notes and checking the property for signs of intrusion. But Mark could tell that the cop thought they were dealing with either pranksters or possibly some kind of shared hallucination brought on by stress. That's when Sarah decided to set up a security camera system. Not just the basic doorbell camera that most people have, but a comprehensive setup with night vision capabilities and motion detection that would record everything happening around their property. She needed proof of what they were experiencing, something concrete that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. And let me tell you, what those cameras captured over the next 2 weeks was something that no one should ever have to see. The footage from the first night showed exactly what Sarah and Mark had described, but seeing it recorded made everything so much worse. The timestamp read 2:17 a.m. when the motion sensors triggered, flooding the backyard with light. And there they were, clear as day on the high-definition cameras. 4 heads this time, floating at different heights between 3 and 6 feet off the ground, all facing toward the house. But what made my skin crawl when Sarah showed me this footage was how the heads moved. They didn't bob or sway like you'd expect if someone was somehow holding them up with sticks or wires. Instead, they glided through the air with fluid, unnatural movements, occasionally rotating a full 360 degrees while maintaining their forward-facing position. It was like watching something that existed outside the normal laws of physics. The cameras recorded for 18 minutes that night. 18 minutes of these things just hovering in the backyard, sometimes moving closer to the house, sometimes drifting back toward the fence line. And the expressions on their faces never changed. Blank, emotionless stares that seemed to look right through the camera lens and into your soul. Mark told me that watching the playback the next morning was one of the most disturbing experiences of his life. Seeing it happen in real time was terrifying, but reviewing the recorded footage frame by frame revealed details that were even more unsettling. The heads weren't just floating randomly. They were following specific patterns, almost like they were conducting some kind of surveillance or gathering information. Sarah noticed something else in the footage that sent chills down her spine. In several frames, you could see additional heads partially obscured by trees and shadows at the edges of the camera's field of view. What they had initially thought was 3 or 4 entities was actually closer to 8 or 9, all positioned at strategic points around their property. That's when they realized this wasn't just some isolated supernatural encounter. Whatever these things were, they were organized, methodical, and they had been watching the house for much longer than anyone had suspected. The random sightings over the past few weeks suddenly made sense. This was reconnaissance. They decided to stay with Sarah's sister for a few days while they figured out what to do next. Mark was still struggling to accept what he'd witnessed, but the video evidence was undeniable. They had multiple angles, high-resolution footage, and audio recordings that captured strange whispers and what sounded like breathing, even though the heads clearly had no bodies attached. But leaving the house didn't solve their problem, it just moved it. On their second night at Sarah's sister's place, the motion sensors they'd left running at their own home started sending alerts to Mark's phone. Alert after alert, every few minutes throughout the night. When they checked the live feed from their cameras, the backyard was full of heads. Dozens of them floating at various heights, all facing toward the house as if they were waiting for something. Sarah's sister lived about 15 minutes away in a different neighborhood entirely. There was no logical way for whatever was haunting their house to know where they'd gone. But around 3 in the morning, Sarah's sister came running into the guest room where they were sleeping, shaking and crying. She'd seen a head floating outside her bedroom window. That's when Sarah realized they weren't just dealing with something that was attached to their house or their property. These things were specifically targeting them, following them wherever they went. The heads weren't bound by location or distance. They could apparently manifest anywhere Sarah and Mark happened to be. Over the next week, the encounters escalated dramatically. The heads started appearing during daylight hours, visible through windows at Mark's office building and outside the restaurant where Sarah worked as a manager. Always just for a few seconds, always perfectly positioned so that only they could see them, and always with that same blank, emotionless stare. Sarah started taking pictures with her phone whenever she spotted one, but the images never came out right. The photos would show the window or the area where she'd seen the head, but the entity itself wouldn't appear in the picture. It was like they existed in a frequency that cameras couldn't quite capture except for their home security system, which continued to record clear footage every single night. The psychological toll was devastating. Sarah couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't function normally, knowing that at any moment she might look up and see one of those faces staring at her. Mark started researching everything he could find about paranormal encounters, looking for explanations or solutions, but nothing he found matched what they were experiencing. That's when they decided to reach out to me. Sarah had been watching my videos for months, and she figured that if anyone might have insights into what they were dealing with, it would be someone who'd studied unexplained phenomena for years. But even after hearing hundreds of scary stories, I had to admit that this case was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. I spent weeks researching similar incidents, reaching out to paranormal investigators, consulting with experts in unexplained phenomena. I found a few cases of floating objects or apparitions, but nothing that specifically involved disembodied heads exhibiting this kind of organized, persistent behavior. The breakthrough came when I connected with a retired anthropologist who'd spent decades studying folklore from around the world. He told me about an obscure legend from Eastern European traditions that described entities called the Watchers. According to these old stories, the Watchers were spirits that appeared as floating heads, sent to observe specific individuals who were marked for some unknown purpose. The legends claimed that once the Watchers began following someone, the encounters would continue to escalate until the person either fled far enough away that the entities couldn't follow, or until the Watchers completed whatever task they'd been assigned. But here's the disturbing part. The folklore never specified what that task actually was. Armed with this information, I helped Sarah and Mark develop a plan. If these things were indeed the Watchers from the old legends, then the traditional methods for dealing with them might actually work. The folklore suggested that the entities were bound by certain rules and limitations, and that there were specific rituals that could break their connection to their targets. I won't go into the exact details of what we tried, partly because I'm not entirely sure it would work for anyone else, and partly because some of this information is genuinely dangerous if used incorrectly. But I will say that it involved a combination of protective symbols, specific prayers from multiple religious traditions, and a cleansing ritual that had to be performed at the exact location where the first encounter occurred. The process took 3 days to complete, and during that time, the activity around their house reached levels that were absolutely terrifying. The cameras recorded over 60 heads floating throughout their property on the final night, moving in complex patterns that looked almost like some kind of ceremonial dance. But when the sun came up on the 4th day, everything stopped. The motion sensors went quiet. The cameras showed nothing but empty yards and normal suburban activity. For the first time in weeks, Sarah and Mark were able to sleep through an entire night without disturbance. That was 8 months ago, and as far as I know, they haven't had any encounters since then. Sarah still sends me updates occasionally, and they've been able to return to something resembling a normal life. But she told me recently that she still can't look out windows at night without feeling a chill of fear, wondering if she'll see those blank staring faces again. This case changed how I think about paranormal encounters. It showed me that there are things out there that operate according to rules we don't understand, with purposes we can't comprehend. The heads weren't trying to harm Sarah and Mark physically, but the psychological impact was devastating. Sometimes the most terrifying experiences are the ones that make you question everything you thought you knew about reality. If you're dealing with something similar, please reach out. Don't suffer in silence like Sarah and Mark did for those first few weeks. And if you see something that seems impossible, don't dismiss it just because it doesn't make logical sense. Sometimes the impossible things are the ones we need to take most seriously. Thanks for watching, and remember to keep your eyes open. You never know what might be watching you back.